It's a little after. I want to thank everybody for showing up for this month's Scientia lecture. The 2015-2016 lecture series focuses on the topic of inequality. And inequality, as you probably know, is a complex issue that touches on differences between groups across social, economic, political, cultural, and technological dimensions. And we're lucky today to have two individuals who are going to address inequalities that stem from both the post-carbon environment, or economy, and the growing opportunity gap, partly directed through technology as well as social and cultural differences. Today's lectures are going to be moderated by Edward Knightley, who's a professor and department chair of electrical and computer engineering here at Rice. Edward's an IEEE fellow, a Sloan fellow, and a recipient of the National Science Foundation's Career Award. Currently serves as editor-at-large for IEEE/ACM. I know what IEEE is, and I forget what ACM is, so I'm just going to leave it as the acronyms on transactions on networking. He continues to be interested in ways to extend wireless networks in Houston's under-resourced communities. I'll talk to him afterwards about getting my particular neighborhood resourced. It's terribly under-resourced. And I've asked him to introduce our two speakers today, and he'll serve as the moderator. So, Edward, turn the floor over to you.
I also extend my welcome to you all, and we've got really exciting topic today with two speakers who are going to talk not just about two very broad and important issues about inequality, technology, and the environmental side, but what I'm really looking forward to about these two presentations is they're very much geared towards Houston, so they're going to take these really large global issues, and we're going to zoom in right here on our community nearby us. So my role as moderator is to introduce these two fantastic speakers. So what I'm going to do is I'll introduce Willow Creek first, and then Alan Pope later on, and we'll divide the discussion into those two presentations. We'll have a brief Q&A between the two, and then we'll have a more extended sort of panel-style discussion for questions and comments, either of them. Towards them in reception after that. So I'll start with Dr. Will Reed. So Will Reed received his doctorate from SMU in Dallas, and starting in 1997, he founded Technology for All. And Technology for All started as a institution for serving underserved communities with the tools of technology. And under Will's leadership, it's tremendously grown. So in around 2010, he received almost a $10 million federal grant, and then another $8 million in private dollars to provide almost 100 public computer centers in Texas: Austin, Houston, San Antonio, rural Texas. And they've trained over 250,000 people in computing technology. Numbers that are just so astounding. I try to think, how many people has Rice trained? Not 250,000 here at Rice, all of Rice. Today he's he was the founder of Technology for All then, and he today remains the leader and CEO of Technology for All. So with that, Will, our first speaker.
Okay. Thank you, Edward. Let me do a little switcheroo here and get up the PowerPoint that we're using for this. And okay. Let me start by saying that I was born into a middle-class home. My father was a research chemist, so I feel a little kinship with Rice. He was not a student here, but maybe that lets me be on this campus. My mother was a teacher. We were not rich and we were not poor, but we had what we needed, and the opportunity and the means for my brother and I to attend private universities. I grew up in a small town called Lake Jackson, Texas, not too far from here. And it was a town that was very diverse socioeconomically and also diverse in terms of ethnicity, black, brown, and white. I'm getting some feedback. Does it feel like feedback? Let me turn this off. Okay. So our parents included working professionals with advanced degrees and also working class folk. And our town had a culture that valued education and expected most of us to graduate from high school and go on to college. And these and many other things created opportunities for us in that small town. But there is a growing opportunity gap in America today, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. As Edward mentioned, I run an organization called Technology for All, and since 2005, Technology for All has collaborated with Rice to provide a platform for Edward's wireless research network in the neighborhood. And because of that research, the community has benefited. Okay, click. Do it this way then. Technology for All is about empowering low-income and underserved communities through the tools of technology, and that is our mission, but it's getting harder. And it's getting harder because there are some things that our organization and other organizations working together with us cannot do. And I would like to explain by introducing you to a part of Houston that you may not know much about. Edward knows a lot about this organization, this community. But let me start with Willow Creek. Willow Creek is a segment of Pecan Park. Pecan Park is the neighborhood in which Edward has been working, but down at the bottom end of Pecan Park is Willow Creek. Willow Creek is a 1,700-unit apartment property that was built in the 1970s. What you see is I-45 South and Loop 610 intersecting. That apartment property has 1,700 units. It was built for singles in the 70s, and now it is teeming with families. And in fact, there are so many families that if you look closely on the screen, you can see to the bottom of the apartment property, Crespo Elementary School and Sanchez Elementary School to the right. These are two elementary schools that HISD built on either side of that apartment property to deal with all the families with children. Many that live in the neighborhood call this property Willow Crack because of the drugs that are available there. But its name comes from Willow Creek, which is the concrete creek that you see kind of going on the north side of the property. And that separates it from the Pecan Park neighborhood, which is that diamond-shaped neighborhood that you see there in this picture. Pecan Park is one of several neighborhoods in Houston's East End. It has an unemployment rate of over 10%. In 2009, it was about 15%. Per capita income in the neighborhood is $11,000. And think about what you could do with $11,000. Pay cash for a decent used car. Maybe pay for that family trip to Europe with the kids, Edward. I don't know how much that costs, but perhaps that's an option. Pay the property taxes. But $11,000, think about that as per capita income. But at Willow Creek and in Pecan Park, that $11,000 is for food, clothing, shelter, and not much more. So what I'd like to do is to talk about a tale of two neighborhoods. Pecan Park on the right, and what the City of Houston calls the University Place super neighborhood here around Rice University. Per capita income in this neighborhood is around $70,000, and the unemployment rate is around 3.6%. And these two different neighborhoods belong to two very different universes. Here, highly educated professionals like yourselves and students enjoy lattes at Fellini and Salento and other spots. You shop in the boutiques in the village, or maybe some of you do. I know my wife does. And then people return home to the shade of this prestigious university and stone and brick houses that range in value from hundreds of thousands of dollars to several $1 million. A one-bedroom apartment at Willow Creek for a family of 5 will rent for from $600 to $700 a month. And the disparity there reminds me of an article that I saw in the Houston Chronicle last summer, which talks about the widening gap, how income inequality is glaringly apparent in Houston, and it needs to be addressed, according to the headline of the article. So what does it cost to live in Houston? Well, in 2013, here was a headline in the paper. What does it cost to live decently here? $63,000 for a family of four, without cable, without internet, without savings. $63,000. So what I'd like to do for a little bit is to look more closely at the two neighborhoods. And here is a comparison of the two neighborhoods, and take a minute just to kind of look at those statistics. The neighborhoods are not too far apart in terms of population, in terms of families. They're about the same. Household size, almost double the size of a household. The household size is almost double in Pecan Park. Median household income, you can see the difference there. And per capita income, you see the difference there. But the thing that is most startling to me is educational attainment. In the neighborhood around our office, TFA's office in the East End, 65 to 70% of the adults do not have a high school diploma. Do not have a high school diploma. Only 3.6% have a college degree, and just over 1% have a graduate degree. In this neighborhood, 78.3% of the adults have a college degree. 43% have a graduate degree. And my hunch is that the 22% of the adults in this neighborhood who do not have a college degree are students on this campus. Yet these two neighborhoods belong to very different neighborhoods. So let me share with you some other comparisons. These are pictures from the Pecan Park neighborhood. How many of you have seen a bank of pay telephones around Rice University? When was the last time you saw a pay telephone? I don't even remember, except there are pay telephones. This is across from McDonald's in our neighborhood. There's also a place to buy potable water if you do not have water at your home. There's also a place to cash your check or send money back home to Central America, to Mexico, or another country. For those who can afford it, there is one preschool in Pecan Park. So what's the significance of that? Timothy Bartek, who is an economist at the Upjohn Institute in Kalamazoo, Michigan, focuses research on economic development and investing in young children. And he's written a book called Investing in Kids, and Rice professor Steve Murdoch quotes him in his book, Changing Texas. Bartek suggests that the evidence is strong that early childhood education can significantly increase the income and future earnings of low-income children. In fact, evidence suggests that every 1 year of full-time, high-quality child care from shortly after birth to age 5 will increase that child's income as an adult by 35%, their annual income. Pecan Park has one small public library, but it also has several HISD schools and a Houston Community College campus, which makes a lot of sense since the average age is 26.7. But transportation is perhaps the most interesting thing to me, and that is, the reason I say that is that there are many people in that neighborhood for whom public transportation and their 2 feet are the primary modes of transportation. So in my work with Technology for All, I'm concerned about digital inclusion. And digital inclusion is something that is like a three-legged stool. In Pecan Park, it is my goal to make sure that folks have the same opportunities in terms of digital inclusion that many of us take for granted, because we have the world at our fingertips. If we don't know an answer to a question, we can instantly pull out our smartphone and Google it. By the way, did you know that Google is, of course you knew this, Google is both a noun and a verb in the online dictionary on my smartphone, but when Technology for All was started in 1997, Google did not exist. So to be fully engaged in today's world, you need these 3 things. You need devices, you need connectivity, you need knowledge, skills, and abilities. Devices are the smartphones, the tablets, the the laptops, whatever we have that are ubiquitous in this community. In my possession right now, I've got 3 devices. My hunch is that if we were to poll this room, there would be many more devices in this room than there are people. Am I correct? Yep. Connectivity. Connectivity is something we take for granted. We have connectivity that's ubiquitous across the Rice campus, is my hunch. Am I correct? Anywhere you go, you can get connected. And with that, we access the internet. We access our data files that may be stored in the cloud and all kinds of other things that we may need. And then we have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to get online and do all the things that we want to do. But this is an example of the growing opportunity gap because the digital participation in the digital world requires the knowledge, skills, and abilities and the opportunities that we take for granted. For example, my birthday is in August, and if I want to renew my driver's license, I don't go stand in the line outside the driver's license office. It is too hot to do that. I renew my driver's license online. We look for jobs, we read a good book, we take an online course. HISD is attempting to level the playing field through what they call the Power Up initiative. And Power Up is an attempt to create digital equity across the school district with students, with parents, and with teachers. Pecan Park and University Place are both located in HISD. And Power Up provides a laptop and a Microsoft OneDrive cloud account for every student across the district. Assignments and materials are placed online by teachers in the HISD hub. Parents can access attendance and grades, etc., through what is called PS Connect. And there is connectivity at school, but not at home. So surely Power Up is going to help level the playing field for all students across HISD. Won't this mean that the opportunities that we take for granted in places like this will also be available to folks in the neighborhoods like there are around the TFA's office in Houston East End? Surely we will begin to see a closing of the opportunity gap. Well, I was talking to Sid Burris earlier, and we both agreed that the data says no. The data says no. And let me tell you why. In Philadelphia, there are 2 similar communities, Chestnut Hill and a community referred to as the Badlands. And the public libraries in those communities provide similar resources to those communities. There are 2 professors, Susan Newman and Donna Solano, who spent hundreds of hours watching what people did in both of those libraries. They were especially interested in how the introduction of computers in those libraries would level the playing field for children and young people in the places of concentrated affluence and in places of concentrated poverty. And so they undertook observations with a hopeful frame of mind, but what they discovered was unexpected. After many hours of analysis and observation, what they discovered is that the very tools that they expected would level the playing field were in fact unleveling it. The not so small disparities of opportunity and skills for children of affluence and children of poverty were getting larger. So what they say is that technology is actually increasing the gap between rich and poor, between minorities and those who are ready for a higher education and those that are not. So let me give you a Houston example. But first, again, what do we do online? We access our files. We read books across on our devices of various types. We reserve seats on an airplane for the next trip. We interact through various social media with people all across the world. Recently, and this is a picture of it, recently we took a team of Technology for All volunteers to Milby High School. It was open house night, and the Milby High School principal, Roy De La Garza, asked us to come help sign up parents for PS Connect. Remember, PS Connect is a part of the Power Up initiative. And PS Connect allows parents to check their students' attendance. It allows them to look at grades, to review assignments, and even to receive notes from teachers. And so our goal was to help parents sign up. And we were busy all evening. But about half of the parents who came for help did not have an email address. The other half of the parents did not speak English. And so we used our Spanish-speaking volunteers to help with them. Spanish was their only language. Many were also uneasy about using and navigating the online tool, the PS Connect tool. And you think about technology as an equalizer, but what seems to be happening is just the opposite. And so the opportunities that are being created by technology are growing the gap for others. Gaps between rich and poor, between black and white and brown, between those that are ready for school and those that are not. Poor children bring less knowledge, skills, and abilities to their encounters with computers. But here's another thing. When the Milby High School students go home at night, approximately 40% of them will not have any connectivity to go home to. Technology for All is a part of what is called the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and recently that group published this list of the top 25 worst connected cities. I don't know if you've looked at the list, but there are 4 Texas cities on this list. Brownsville is number 1, but also on the list were Laredo and El Paso and Dallas. 4 cities in Texas. 44% of the households in Brownsville, Texas do not have internet access. What I want to say to you today is that Brownsville and Pecan Park are very similar. 44% do not have internet access. This photo that I'm going to show you is taken just a few blocks from the TFA office. Just a few blocks from our office. Digital skills are becoming increasingly important in most key institutions in our society. Government and business and healthcare and education. They expect and most often just simply assume that people will have access to the internet and the digital and literacy skills to utilize it. Some say that the unleveling impact of technology also has to do with a phenomenon called the Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is a term that was coined by Robert Merton in 1968, making reference to a line in the Gospel of Matthew. For those who have will receive more, and they will have more than enough. But as for those who don't have, even the little they have will be taken away from them. In other words, the Matthew effect of accumulated advantage is the phenomenon where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Back. Earlier this month, Professor Angus Deaton received the Nobel Prize, or was announced as the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. And he spent a career improving the data and public policy decision-making around poverty and equality. I read a New York Times article about the award, and they quoted from his 2013 book, The Great Escape, where he said, more people are richer and fewer people live in dire poverty. Lives are longer, and parents no longer routinely watch a quarter of their children die. And he counts climate change, Albert, as an increased inequality in developing nations as threats to this progress. And the growing gaps pose a new kind of economic and political challenge. In talking about the award on NPR, he said, I think inequality has gone past the point where it's helping us all get rich, and it's really becoming a serious threat. And he noted in particular what he described as the opposition of many wealthy people to the politics addressing climate change. What a surprise. Earlier this year, Robert Putnam, professor at Harvard, came out with this book, Our Kids. It's a book full of numbers and graphs, but one of the things that he says in the book, throughout the book, is that there is a widening class-based opportunity gap among young people. He says there's diminishing life opportunities of lower-class families and expanding opportunities for upper-class families, and they're growing further and further apart. Now, I'm not a researcher like many of you, but I can share with you story after story from Houston's East End to illustrate. At the Technology for All office at Mission Milby, I've listened to high school kids struggle when they try to read. High school kids. Roy De La Garza, who's the principal at Milby High School, has reminded me more than once of the direct connection between reading and the ability of students to do well in other subjects. Many of the high school kids that I also encounter there at our office are working 20 to 30 hours a week to help their families make ends meet. Some feel compelled to drop out of school in order to work more and help their family. Many are also in families where one or more persons is undocumented, and that complicates matters even more. In Pecan Park, as I mentioned, Spanish is the language at home for many. And connectivity and suitable computers at home are also more often than not non-existent. And these are some of the reasons I'm concerned about things like Power Up and other initiatives, because what's happening is that the already advantaged are gaining more from the technology than the ones who are less advantaged, and the gap is widening. And so with books and reading and the most knowledgeable, those folks are going to be better positioned to use the tools that we have to leap further ahead. And so the opportunity gap grows. So the question is, what can we do? And this is the question for perhaps a discussion at the end of all this, but let me just make a few comments. Recently, the Ford Foundation, one of America's largest foundations, decided that they were going to redirect all of their resources to focusing on racial, gender, financial, and other inequalities. All of their philanthropy, all of their decision-making, all of their research focused on inequality. Steve Murdoch, professor here at Rice, says that Texas faces a challenge and that we must be willing to consider and promote programs that will help to bring the levels of socioeconomic resources to poor neighborhoods in the same way that they are in the more affluent neighborhoods. So we need to work together to increase the levels of education in places across our city. We also perhaps need to be advocating for ways in which we can help people gain the knowledge, skills, and abilities, the digital skills that they need to participate fully in today's world. One of the questions that some of my colleagues in this work are asking, and this is a question I'll pose to you, should broadband connectivity, for instance, be managed and deployed like regulated public utilities, like electricity, for instance? I wonder about that. Should that be done? So those are just some thoughts. One of the things Technology for All is trying to do is, we're doing our part as best we can to try to train people with basic computer skills. But if you don't have all three of those things, the three legs of the stool, devices, connectivity, and the knowledge, skills, and abilities to use them, you will not have access to the same opportunities that all of us take for granted. Thank you.
We'll take maybe one question now, and then we'll do the remainder later. So any one question?
What's the, I don't know if there's statistics on this, but what's the average length of time that citizens in that neighborhood have been in the U.S.?
I don't know the answer to that question. Many of those folks own homes in that community.
Multi-generational living?
Yes. And there's a multi-generational history. Only 34% of the adults have a high school diploma. And if you look back for several years, that number has stayed pretty constant. But there are a lot of homeowners in the neighborhood. The Willow Creek Apartments has a lot more transient, moving in and moving out kind of stuff. But in the neighborhood itself with single-family homes, many of those folks have been there for a long time. But the culture of valuing education is really different than in this neighborhood.
Okay, so we'll have more Q&A afterwards. We'll have Albert's presentation next week. Thank you again.
Okay.
So our second presentation is Professor Albert Pope, and he received his bachelor's in architecture from Southern California Institute of Architecture and then his master's from Princeton. He is a professor here at Rice
Thanks a lot. And thank you, Will. That was a terrific presentation. I will try to follow on it. Let me see what kind of forwarding controls I might have.
Speak up, Howard.
Hold on. Oh, let me. I'm good. Oh, cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, we're going to move a little bit from the digital world to the physical world, but we're in very much the same place in terms of Houston, in terms of the socioeconomics of the environment that I've been working in for quite some time, which is called the Fifth Ward. Probably you know where it is. It's northeast of downtown. And I introduce it here in this little diagram that shows its relationship to the key aspects of the city, including the central business district, the loop system, and most important for the content of the little talk, the bayou system, the Buffalo Bayou watershed that runs through the city. 7 bayous branching off of it, or 6 that branch off of it, making a network that runs laterally west to east, in somewhat counterpoint to the centralized diagram of the city. It's a good way for me to, in some ways, begin to talk about urbanism in the context of form. The little drawing on the right, the black and white one, is a plan that was done in 1912 of Houston's park system, projected Houston park system. And it is, let's just say that it had some prophetic powers, that it suggested that we connect the city through the bayous. This was 103 years ago. You can see Rice in the lower left-hand corner. I don't know if this is a pointer. Which is right there, a little wedge, which they imagined a boulevard circling the city at about this size. They were a little bit off on that. But one of the reasons I put it up is that things in cities move slow. Cities are more like sequoia trees than people, right? They have long time frames, and they evolve over this period of time. In this case, a plan that was actually conceived of 103 years ago, you may know, has now actually been achieved. Bayou Greenways 2020 in Houston has just connected 150 miles of public linear park public access, and off-road pathways that run through the 7 bayous on the Buffalo watershed and the 2 more bayous to the north and south. The next city that has a linear system of any consequence is Portland, and it has 82 miles of park. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, something that could only happen in Houston. This park system could finally be put together and begin, hopefully, to have a significant impact on the city. What I would like to talk about is the interaction between the social environment, the social inequalities that Will was talking about, and the environmental problems that we're facing. Given the title of the talk, I'm talking about carbon, and trying in some ways to get a handle on the elephant in the room, what we know about carbon, what we know we need to do, and what in fact we're not doing. The conviction behind this project, which is funded by the Shell Center here on campus for sustainability, was that you can't solve the environmental problems without the social problems. The two are interconnected. The problems of climate change are of such a scope, difficulty, complexity, that to think that there would be a simple technical fix, that it could be done, channeled through one aspect of social change. One level of social change is in some ways already off the table. It's a concerted change. It is a technical change. It's an economic change. It is a social change, and it's obviously an environmental change. Which is why it made sense for us to put the environmental and the social issues together in a single project. This is a very washed out slide of the Fifth Ward, which is where we've been working. I think Will covered in his talk the inequalities that also are playing out in the Fifth Ward. I really don't need to go through them. You can see right up here the statistics, which are very much like the area that Will was talking about. It has access to the Bayou system. It's built right on it. It was first founded it was first set up. It was a freedmen's town after the Civil War, set up by black slaves, but really took off with cotton warehouses on its southern border and barges coming up the bayou and taking the cotton out, cotton and timber. It has gone through a remarkable history. It's been cut, chopped, chewed. Freeways have run through it. Railroads have run through it. Poverty has covered it for most of its existence, and it still endures. And I could talk for a long time about the Fifth Ward. This is perhaps the worst projector I've ever seen, because this is actually a really beautiful drawing done by this guy here of the Fifth Ward, a chunk of it, which shows the areas that I was just talking about. That's the bayou. We were just looking at the picture of the KBR site. That was the KBR building right there. The freeways, which for reasons I'll explain, we're showing as blank. And the area that I want to focus in on, we're doing a project for the entire 6.2 miles of the Fifth Ward, and we're developing it over a 50-year period in 10-year phases. The idea is to get at the end of 50 years, not only carbon neutrality, neutrality of emissions, but also the capacity going into the future from that point to actually participate in remediation. The area, even though we're focusing on the entire ward, we're zeroing in on one district. I'm zeroing in on one district just to show a piece of the plan and maybe connect it up to the scale of work that Will is doing, which is the bottom corner, which I pointed out. In this part of the ward with the bayou running on the bottom. This is the street plan, and you can see it's been torn up over the years. Again, the area that we're looking at is in this corner, which is mostly industrial, and on this east and south at the bayou, where the old cotton warehouses were, and residential on the north and west. In our projects, we laid out in each district an area we call the holdout, which is the base of new development. And it's an area that would not be altered, that would be in some ways preserved over the course of the 50-year plan and serve that anchor the neighborhood. Just a little, I like to kind of show you where we're going. This is where we're going after the 50-year period. It's a little bit of a time bubble where we are pushing towards high-density development. We're combining a series of of carbon sinks in the form of tree plantations that will absorb carbon from the atmosphere and provide the ability to store it. One of the best ways to store carbon is not to pump it underground, but actually to store it in a block of wood. Wood is 50% of its weight is carbon. We don't really think of wood as carbon storage, but in fact it is. It's a block of carbon storage. And the logic of pulling carbon out of the air, storing it in wood, using the wood is really, in a very simple way, what the project is based on. The way we want to kick off this renovation is to make a connection between, this is the existing Pecan Park area, which you see up in the corner here. It's a quite nice park surrounded by the high school, elementary school, a church. It has a civic core. It seems to us a good place to start. What is oftentimes a problem in any kind of redevelopment is how it is you get started. What's the catalyst? The bulk of the plan presumes a carbon market, which I think is not very hard within the next 10-year period. We know how much climate change is starting to get into the water supply, right? We're beginning to think about it more. The Pope comes, talks about it to the Congress. COP21, which is the UN institute that holds meetings regularly on climate change, is having a big meeting in December in Paris, which will be a big deal. The profile of climate change is being raised considerably. China has announced a carbon market in 2017 based on California's. Carbon markets are not hard to predict. That they will, their emergence, I think, is something that is not a stretch, a long stretch of the imagination. It's actually short. However, short it may be, what we want to do with this project is kick off the first 10-year increment, not through carbon, because we're not there yet, but through redevelopment. And of taking this area of before and of transforming it on the basis of redevelopment, on the basis of a public-private partnership. And what we want to do is to use the body, Buffalo body, and its Is this better?
Yes.
Does that work? Sorry. The Bayou Network that I just spoke of runs through at the base of the, this is confusing, right here. There's a beautiful tributary, one of the few uncovered tributaries to Buffalo Bayou. It's totally natural state, called Japhet Creek, no concrete. Japhet Creek, which has survived through neglect. And the city bought in the 90s and owns up to this point where they've got a scrubby little park on Clinton. What we have is a tiny, tiny gap to connect Finnegan Park, which is at the center of the district, the Lockwood district, to not only the Japhet Creek and Japhet Creek Park, but to the entire Bayou system. That's the catalyst. Too often, the riverfront, waterfront developments like the Bayou plans that are fantastic, that have been part of our history and are going to become a greater part of our history, are just beauty strips. What's the effect on the environment beyond them? This is a speculation on how this Greenways project could actually reach beyond the banks of the bayou, touch a piece of the city, and use that as have that serve as a catalyst for redevelopment. Those are the pieces. That's the piece of the Japhet Creek. That's the Japhet Creek Park where it hits Clinton, and this is Finnegan Park. The reason we think it'll be a catalyst is because, this is annoying, is because of this the nature of this greenways, bayou greenways. And this is zoomed out a little bit. And the relationship between this banded, the bayous that essentially run, again, in a simplified diagram to make it clear, from west to east, and overlay this centrally planned city. The most astonishing single fact about the Bayou Greenway is that 60% of Houston's population will be within a mile and a half of one of the bayous, right? That's a form of walkability. That's a form of new urban connectivity that doesn't exist now. Walkability is something that people really want in a city. Unfortunately, it oftentimes gets channeled into really naive notions like somehow we can turn Houston into a species of Brooklyn, right? It's not going to happen. Houston has very different DNA than Brooklyn does. The way it is set out, the way it is developed, it has a different form of connectivity, I think, in the presence of this greenway. What that means is that it's not just an amenity, this greenway. It is, in fact, a significant future connector for the development of Houston. And the claim that I would make is what the freeway network was in the last half century in terms of urban development. The Bayou network will be in the next century in terms of the next half century of urban development. Why would I say something like that the Bayou is going to replace the freeway as the driver of urban development? I think I'm probably pretty much preaching to the choir here, in case I'm not, or in case you haven't noticed the news. The numbers, the problem, the climate problem is extraordinary. There are no precedents for it. The 2 degrees Celsius that we've agreed internationally, it's still a contested figure, but we've agreed internationally, is what we have to keep warming down to in order to avoid massive disruptions, agricultural disruptions, sea level rise, migration, etc. Even though it's contested, it is a very high bar to pass. 565 gigatons of carbon is what we can put in maximum to stay under that 2 degrees. At the rate we're going, we'll hit that in 15 years. As a point of note, the fossil fuel industry has 3,000 gigatons of unburnt CO2 on its balance sheets. That's a huge problem. It's 5 times of what can be burnt in order to keep the planet below 2 degrees. The final number is 80% per capita. That's about what we would have to do in the United States. The reduction we would have to achieve per capita in order to keep surface temperature warming down to 2 degrees. 80% is a figure that is so staggering, you kind of want to just walk out the door and go do something productive, right? Because there's no way, it's difficult to get your head around that. Never mind start to work towards it. One of the ways we wanted to start to work towards it is to say, simply, instead of just repeating the number or reading another report or another piece of journalism, what would a city look like with a 80% per capita reduction in energy consumption? If we project an image of that city, would we become more aware of the implications of what the climate scientists are telling us? We obviously live in carbon, the very epicenter of the carbon economy. This is another piece of the bayou that's part of the picture, which is a ship channel and a transport for exporting pet coke, petroleum coke, which is a byproduct of refining. It's, I think I put it up there not only to drive the problem home, but to also connect it to the waterways. The city has always been connected to the waterway. Its fate has been tied to the bayou system. It has brought us where we are today, right? We wouldn't be the second largest port and the largest oil refinery in the country if they weren't for the bayou system. The bayou system, the carbon economy may not survive into the 21st century, but I'm willing to bet that the bayou system will. This is a picture that I go to bed at night and playing out on my retina. I can't get it out of my head, in other words. This is appropriately enough, the energy corridor. That is the Beltway. And looking in the distance of downtown, and this is, of course, I-10. This is our problem. Our infrastructure is built out in the fashion that it requires an enormous amount of energy from us to use it, right? That is in, I think, the question of locked in with this kind of urban infrastructure, with a average density of 5 to 7 units per acre. Our consumption is actually built into the very form of the city. Or is it? Which is why the question mark is in there. This is an old and really famous diagram. You may have seen it. This is the amount of fuel equivalents in the vertical column per person, I think, and the amount of population distribution that over an area. So the larger area per person goes to the right, the higher gasoline per person goes up, and we have Hong Kong, European cities clustered down here, Australia, Canada in the middle, and us occupying the upper corner. If this is all I had to say, I could turn off the slides and go home, and maybe maybe some people would do that. If you actually know something about cities, you know the answer to this question, which is that we're not locked in. Cities grow in 50-year cycles. What that simply means is that the life of span of a building in Houston averages out at 50 years, right? Very few buildings that are more than 50 years old survive. A big exception, obviously, being the campus, but we know that actually the buildings, even on the campus, are completely gutted and rebuilt after 50 years. The 50-year cycle is one that replaces the entire city. So if I did a thought experiment and went out, beyond into any part of the city and time traveled 50 years ahead, say out on Westheimer, everything I would be looking at from that 50-year vantage would be built in the last 50 years. 50 years forward vantage would be built starting today, which means there's a complete cycle every 50 years. The obvious question is, if we're going to rebuild the city every 50 years, if we can imagine ourselves moving forward 50 years and looking at what we've done, the question is, how do we do? Right? Did we build what we needed to build? Did we respond to what we know now we need to build in terms of this 80% number? Did we, the even more important question, did we even imagine what we needed to build over the next 50 years in order to respond to what we know now? This comes from knowing the nature of a city and the fact that a city it has a cycle, and that this cycle can be tied to other cycles. This is unfortunately not even close to reading, because within this 50-year cycle, it looks really great on my screen there, you've got 4 12-year cycles that sit within it. And what we're imagining in a very simple way, back to the question of wood, is to what extent we can put the city into the carbon cycle and overlap the 50-year cycle of buildings with the 25-year, roughly 12 to 25-year cycle of planting and harvesting trees, storing carbon in the process. Back to our gap. This is what we're dealing with in the Fifth Ward and the immediate replacement. And this series of washed out slides, the first building to replace the first wave of demolition of buildings that have timed out, that their expiration date has passed, that if we're able to make a connection between the bayou and the park to trigger development, we're stabilizing the area within what I was saying was the holdout, and we're beginning to plant out the open spaces that are left over in a series of scheduled cycles that begin a process, a 10-year process. In addition to planting trees, we have done some very interesting research into the possibilities, which are within our graphs today, of building dense high-rise structures out of wood, CLT, cross-laminated timber, which is what is represented here. To date, there's buildings that have been built of 15 stories. There's buildings that have been engineered up to 42 stories. We're imagining a combination, material culture, if you will, between the ability of trees to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. What's going to happen to wood when a carbon market kicks in is that it will go from one of the most expensive materials to build with to one of the cheapest. Concrete is extremely carbon intensive. You have to heat concrete in order to get it to make it in limestone into concrete. Steel is also carbon intensive. Wood is not. Wood is renewable. When a carbon market kicks in, wood is going from a fine material, some of the finest material, to actually the cheapest building material that you can imagine. That will be available to us to build out of, which is why we're looking into these technologies. It also happens to work in a very interesting way to play against the stigmas that are associated with high-rise development and the problems that many of us have with it. Right now, what is clear to hit, if we're going to hit this 80% mark, is that we're going to have to build dense. All of the information points in that direction. If you noticed on the other end of the slide, and I've got a slide coming up that shows that there's only one modern city in the world that hits that per capita expenditure that we need to hit to keep us at 2 degrees, and that's Hong Kong. And that's due almost entirely to the extraordinary density that they've achieved there. The mass transit system, it's 95% of the population does not own a car. And in many ways, it's clear that the 7 unit per acre model that we are using today will need to be phased out into a high density model that will have the ability, the density that is capable of supporting a sophisticated mass transit system, right? It seems like a stretch. It seems like something that is impossible in the context of Houston. it seems like only something as extraordinary as the conditions that we're facing today with the climate problem could actually be a catalyst for this kind of transformation. This is 2025. These are the growing rates. These are the rates at which these species, loblolly pine, eucalyptus, ponderosa pine, and a hardwood, a black walnut, that grow in the area actually absorb carbon. There's a steep uptick at the first, and then it falls off, at which point you harvest, store the carbon in the wood, use the wood for construction. This is some of the results of combining here the two main aspects of the project, which is the aspect of wood construction, the CLT construction here, and the planting cycle, to integrate those two together and create this a different set of possibilities. So this is phased in 5-year increments. So this is actually looking at 2035. What we're looking at is not a master plan. It's a system. It's a way of generating between the carbon plantations, the development of urban form, which is something I'm not showing you today, and the wood construction. It's a system that could grow at different speeds and rates like all cities do. It's not planned out as a fixed composition. This is where we could be in 2035. It is where we could be in 2040. I guess the bottom line is we need to get there as soon as possible. And these are the aspects of the project. Very simply, the carbon sinks, the wood construction, and the bayous, connections to the bayou. That's again the Japhet Creek Bayou. And to finish up, this is the diagram I was mentioning. This is per capita consumption of kilograms of oil equivalent. This is the United States per capita consumption. This is European, which were double. This is the world average per capita consumption. And as I mentioned before, that darker line right there is Hong Kong. That fits at the bottom. We need to think of a different kind of density. We're not going to build like Manhattan. Even if we could, which we can't, it doesn't make sense, given what we're capable of, to just heap buildings onto blocks like Midtown. What is necessary is to build both density and simultaneously build open space, hand in hand, not just pile on more mass, which is what our present model, the last model that we used when we built with any density, which was 50 years ago, was that model. That model needs to be upgraded. Thinking through, this is an architectural reference of a plan in the 80s that was about organizing modern cities around voids instead of solids. I could go more in depth into the plan, but I think you get the connection, with the void of the Greenway. This is Buffalo Bayou Park from downtown, from Shepherd, looking towards downtown, which is out of view. And is because of its qualities, its characteristics, the fact that it's a connected public space, could serve as the void, which would anchor a larger scale development of density in the city. And this is I'll just end with that question. We look back 50 years, this is what we're building now in the 5th Ward, which actually would have been illegal before 1950 because it's entirely dependent on air conditioning. There's no natural ventilation and packing buildings this tight together. This is another version of that. These are gated communities. This is how we build density now, right? This is the model we're going to move forward on unless we think through what this next cycle could be, right? If we have a chance over the next 50 years to come up with an alternative to that, we know what this is going to do. We know exactly what that's going to do. What remains to be seen is what can we do with that 50-year cycle? What are we capable of doing with that 50-year cycle that could give us a better outcome? And the question, which I already suggested, which is really the point of the project, is have we even imagined what we can do in that 50-year cycle? This is a way to imagine it. There are many different outcomes. There are many ways to skin a cat. There are many ways to get to density. This is one. The problem is not imagining what it could be. Just like the plan that I started out with of the 1912 plan for Houston's bayous. It's a long timeline, which we have to shorten. But in the meantime, I think what we have to do is imagine what we need to do. And that essentially is what the project is about. Thanks a lot.
Okay, we're a little bit over, but thanks so much.
Sorry
for
about that.
Fantastic presentation. What we'll do is I'll start with a question for Professor Pope, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Sometimes to challenge something that seems so self-evidently like the right thing to do, because we want to reduce carbon emissions and want to make things better in the Fifth Ward. But I want to challenge you on whether the Fifth Ward is the right place to be doing targeting reductions in carbon emissions. Because the thing about reductions in carbon emissions is that the benefits are global, is that you don't benefit a local community by reducing their carbon footprint. They're part of a global need to bring down global emissions. And if it's being done in ways that make the homes more expensive with more expensive materials, does that hurt the goal of affordable housing there? You brought up loblolly pines and eucalyptus. Loblolly pines are huge emitters of monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes, which contribute to secondary organic aerosols. Eucalyptus are heavy emitters of isoprene, which contribute to the ozone smog locally. And this neighborhood, by being relatively poor, I don't know the exact statistics, but probably has smaller homes and lower levels of energy use and thus carbon emissions than some of the wealthier parts of town. And so what's the justification for targeting a relatively poor neighborhood to be a bigger carbon sink and reduce its carbon emissions?
Because it's a travesty, the area that needs to be rebuilt more than any other area in the city that exists. Maybe I'm wrong with that, but having not done an exhaustive survey, I think the ability to combine redevelopment with the beginnings of a response to carbon made sense to us. There's part of the project, as I was mentioning, that it could be applied to anywhere on the bayou, right? We use the Fifth Ward as a test case exactly because we think it's an inclusive problem. We think we can kill two birds with one stone. I think if we're going to get out of this mess, we're going to need to kill two birds with one stone. In that case, redevelopment and the beginnings of a city that makes sense in the context of the climate problems that we have. There are always going to be pitfalls to this species of wood or that species of wood. There'll be ways that you could calculate different species would be better or not. That's less the issue. We're looking at the broader strokes. We're actually doing a conference on this, a more complete presentation of the plan we'll do a week from Thursday with the Shell Center, where we have a forester coming in to talk about the development of loblolly pines. He actually works at the enormous pine plantation that Rice University owns in Louisiana. At any rate, the idea of putting it in the Fifth Ward, which I had the same, why use the most disadvantaged people as a test case? The answer to that really is the first phase of the problem can do many things. It can address many of the problems that Will was bringing up.
Yeah.
This
provides research and community benefit all at the same time.
yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
Which is why we went through there. But our ambitions really were, and the reason I kept talking about the Bayou Greenways is to expand it out to the entire system, right? A way of thinking how all of Houston could grow in this next cycle, not just the Fifth Ward.
Okay, we'll open it up to more questions for either Bill or Paul.
Have you considered using the waterway for mass transit?
Yeah, that's, I have there's a magazine that the Rice Design Alliance puts out called CITE, C-I-T-E. I just published an article about the Bayou Greenway systems, and it's one of the reasons I've said that I think the Bayou system will replace the freeway as the next engine of urban development. And they're not, the Parks Board that controls the network is not, they know that. Right?
We have a microphone as well, so we'll wait this time. Right
Jim Elliott, Sociology here at Rice. I found both presentations really inspiring, and I appreciate them. One of the things that strikes me is an additional challenge. I very much like the let's do some things and the idea that the Bayou network is a connector. And I'm relatively new to Houston, so I don't know the local intricacies, but there is research in the social sciences that suggests that cities with more linear waterways are more segregated, both economically and racially. And that segregation is then inversely correlated with the amount of public expenditures. So maybe this is part of the impetus for having more public-private partnerships. But I'm wondering if we can scale out and think about the challenges. I don't know if it's something we can do today necessarily, but think about how the bayous can be this connector that does away with segregation. Because the bayous, just like the freeways, were used to separate people. There was a natural barrier, right? So, and this segregation is one of the key engines that sort of keeps reproducing these social and economic inequalities. And I don't know if there's a way, or if your team has thought about that, Albert, in terms of how we really use it to connect socially as well as sort of to the carbon cycle. And so the other question is, whenever I go out being a newcomer to Houston, the second question is, I say, hey, we're trying to do things in Houston, we're trying to imagine new problems. And they say, why don't you go to the ship channel and do something about big carbon industry there, and that might solve the issue and help us a lot more than these smaller projects. And to this point, I haven't developed a good answer. So.
The answer to the second one is that we have problems with carbon production, the fossil fuel industry, the pet coke example I showed, and a lot of people are spending a lot of time pointing their finger at the fossil fuel companies saying bad, 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 bad. The problem, if you really want to get to it, is not just production, it's consumption. It's how you have to cut consumption. And it's oftentimes a way for us to relieve ourselves of responsibility to point the finger at someone else. So in some ways, I think because of the big change that we need to make, this drop in consumption of energy consumption and emission, it is on all of us to do it. So it has to reach into the cities, right? It can't just be, we'll have a magical way to refine fossil fuels that will no longer produce carbon emissions, and that will happen overnight. That would be great, and we need that too. But we also need to change the way in which we consume energy, and that digs itself into the city. The first part of your question is too big to discuss here, but I said that Houston has a different DNA than Brooklyn. Houston's DNA is based on a spine, which we call a cul-de-sac. 75% of Houston is cul-de-saced, right? I don't know where you came from, but we have a really high percentage of cul-de-sacing because we're a brand new city, relatively speaking, right? Most of Houston has been built in the last 60 years. And that is both, cul-de-sacing is both a division, but the space that is created between cul-de-sacs, that, for example, a bayou runs in, can also be a space of connection. It's not an absolute, right? You can have that kind of spine-based development and have connectivity that traditional cities had, but in a different way, right? And that's why the Bayou Greenways is so interesting. It's a kind of connectivity that grows out of the spine-based development that Houston is built on. Sorry.
We have a reception waiting for us outside, so further questions you can ask over a glass of wine. And I just want to thank again our two fantastic speakers for really insightful talks. Thank you both very much.
I would like to thank everybody for attending.